of the PTSA. The interesting thing about Otha is that he has a military background, he has his own business, he does consulting, and he's passionate about education. I'm going to start off now, Otha, and I'm going to let you tell my guests a little bit about yourself.
Okay, Rita, first of all, thank you for having me here on the show this evening. And I'm from Elberton, Georgia. Born and pretty much raised here. I lived in Augusta and Savannah for a while. So I went through public school. So I'm from Elberton, Georgia, originally up in Northeast Georgia. I've lived in Augusta and Savannah, Georgia. Basically public schools throughout my life. And then I went to Morehouse in 85 to 89.
Okay.
Graduated from Morehouse and went on into the military. And the reason I went into the military was like a family tradition. You know, we have records of my family being in the military since the 1700s. So it was just a family tradition. I'm oldest of 7.
Okay.
And of the 7, 5 boys, 4 of us are military and combat veterans.
Oh, wow.
And at one time, actually, we were all 2 of us were in Iraq together and 1 was in Afghanistan.
Okay.
So we, again, just a strong military tradition. Went into the military and, like I say, served, been 25 countries in the world, traveling and visiting. And my wife is an educator. Okay. Spelman class of 89 also.
Okay, that's right.
So we ended up, again, her being an educator, and me working closely with my kids. My son graduated from Morehouse. My daughter attended Spelman. So we were very involved in education throughout their lives. And as far as education is concerned, when we moved from Germany in 2005, we Germany to Maryland. I went to my kids' first PTA meeting. My wife was assigned to another high school, so when I showed up to the PTA meeting, there were 7 parents there. And the problem with that was there were 2,000 kids in the school. So the post commander at Fort Meade, we were going through a base realignment at that time, and we were going to get 20,000 more people 5 years later. So when the PTA president said, well, we didn't have enough parents for officers like this year, so we still need parents. So the post commander looked at me and said, Thornton, what are we going to do about this? Okay. And I said, hey, sir, I just arrived in the country about a month ago. He said, what are we going to do about this? So I tell people I was voluntold. I became the vice president of the high school PTA, and that's sort of what really got me.
And so that's how you got started. Okay, let's go back to Elberton, and I want to work my way up to that point in your life. I did a little bit of research about Elberton, Georgia. It seems like a very small town. I think it's called the granite capital of the world.
That is correct.
What was it like growing up there?
Well, it's in the part of the Appalachian zone. And like I say, my family, like my grandfather, they worked in the rock industry, basically. Okay. A good community to grow up in. I moved from there at about 5 years old, moved to Savannah, Georgia. My father attended Savannah State. Okay. So I lived there for about 3 years or so. Okay. Then we moved from Savannah to Augusta for 8.
Oh, wow.
And then the last part of my middle school years, about the end of 7th grade, we moved back to Elberton. Okay. So I went through high school, middle school and high school there in Elberton. Okay. But it was a good place to, raise a family.
So you've pretty much lived throughout different parts of Georgia.
Yes, I have. And as an adult, I lived in Columbus. Okay. I was stationed there for about 1.5 years, and then I worked up at a Boy Scout camp in the northwest corner of the state. So every corner of Georgia.
So you were in Atlanta, of course, for 4 years.
Yes.
While you were at Morehouse.
That's correct.
Okay. Who's your favorite teacher?
I would say in high school it was Mr. Thiel. He was my social studies teacher, which was my favorite subject.
Mine too. I teach social studies. Okay.
One of the things that he did in school was he just put a lot of emphasis on critical thinking. So every day we would start off classes with, what were the events of the day? And he would make you really dig in, and he just would not take pat answers. Right. and using the Socratic method. So it was really, he really stands out. And then my 8th grade teacher, Miss Thornton, not Ken.
Okay.
But what she did for a group of us, she would say, "You're a leader," and so I expect better and the best of leaders. So that really stood out when she did that. She probably did with all the kids, but it really made people strive to really do great things. Expectations.
Okay. Morehouse College. What made you choose Morehouse?
My junior year in Elberton, I was looking at West Point. I was looking at Georgia Military Academy, and so I lined up my visits that year, and Morehouse was my first visit. But my concern was, I said, I want to go to a school where leaders are built. And when I went there, got the campus tour, Martin Luther King, Maynard Jackson, I was like, this is it. This is where I'm supposed to be. So I ended up, I said, that was it. I applied on the spot. I got accepted, early admissions.
Is that the only school you applied to when you did apply?
Yeah.
I did the same thing with Spelman. I only applied to Spelman College, and I sometimes tease my students, and I tell them, had I not been accepted to Spelman, I probably would have worked for the post office and would have been making a lot more money. Okay, well, when you were at Morehouse, what was your major?
It was urban studies with a concentration in planning.
Okay.
What I wanted to do, I wanted to be a city planner. My goal was to graduate from Morehouse, then go to the military for 4 years and come back and be a city planner.
In Elberton?
No, Atlanta. I fell in love with Atlanta when I came here.
I'm saying that because Elberton seems like it may need a little, but I haven't visited, so people of Elberton, don't judge me. I haven't been there. Okay, now after leaving Morehouse, you got a master's degree in rhetoric and scientific technical communication. Could you explain that?
Sure.
What is it, and what type of work do you do with that type of degree?
Okay, well, I was at an engineering school, so I assessed, what are my skill sets. So communications, I took a couple of courses at the graduate school. I say, I like this. Communications are very important. Yes. So I actually, the college had me being a communications professor. And when I would talk to the engineers, or I teach the engineers, I would say, okay, you could be the best engineer in the world, but if you can't communicate your ideas, it will go nowhere. Right. So, at Michigan Tech, I taught like interpersonal, cultural communication courses to students, across the campus, and it was a great experience. Okay, so you have taught before? Yes, I have. Okay. Yes, I have.
So, Michigan Tech, they're the ones who bestowed upon you the doctorate degree, correct? The honorary doctorate degree?
That is correct.
Okay, when was that?
That was 2009.
Oh, wow.
And it was just because of achievement up to that point. I had actually finished my PhD coursework. And I was put on orders to deploy to, overseas, like my last year. And so I ended up leaving, and they remembered that, and I came back a couple of times, and just because of the achievements, nationally and internationally, they awarded me the PhD. Okay. Yeah. Congratulations. Thank you. How long did you serve in the military, and what branch, and how far did you go in the military in terms of rank? 21 years. Wow. I retired as a lieutenant colonel, which is considered a successful career. Yes. And had some great assignments. I think I had the dream assignments. As a matter of fact, my first assignment after training was Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. Okay. So I always joke with my wife and say, that was your 4-year honeymoon. So we did 4 years in Hawaii. My son Trey, who's a Morehouse man, graduated, was born in Hawaii. Oh, okay. And after I left there, I was ready to get out, and they said, well, first I had Hawaii, and it was like, where would you like to go next? I said, I have a say in the matter. It's like, sure. And my wife and I, we were debating, I could have went to anywhere in the world. She said, I want to go back to Georgia. So she won that battle. So we came back to Fort Stewart, Georgia,
Okay.
South Georgia, where, we were, close to home.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just had a lot of great choices throughout my career. And I ended my career in the White House. I received a call in 2007
Okay.
To come down to the Army Human Resource Headquarters. And they called me down and they said, hey, we're looking at nominating you for a White House position. Would you be interested?
Oh, wow.
So I went through that selection process where they checked out your background. I had strong manner of performance throughout my military career. And I worked there from 2007 through 10.
Wow. Impressive. So then you were there pretty much during the term of President Obama.
That is correct. I had a little short break. I did a short Iraq tour in there, but I actually, and I tell people a story, the importance of education and the opportunities, critical thinking skills. I remember when I was interviewed and once I was hired, President Bush's communications commander called me in and said, congratulations, you had the job. And he said, you know why we hired you? I said, why, sir? He said, well, you think quick on your feet, and that's what we need for people working around the president. And he said, when the new president comes on, that time we didn't, President Obama, Senator Obama hadn't announced.
Exactly.
He said, we're going to have a whole new communication suite, and one of your primary responsibilities will be to hire, to help us hire and man the White House Communications Agency. And I said, okay, sir, I got it. I understand. And he said, and the technology is still on the table. And I said, I'm ready to get fired now. but anyway, but again, the education, piece kicked in, critical thinking. And I said, okay, I need to find the technical experts. And because working in the military, now the White House environment is almost civilian-like. Although we were military, we wore suits. So I pulled together a team. And we talked about the technology and what was there. And we talked about what type people we needed. And I had to target areas, say we need to go to the Special Operations Command to get people to work with this type of equipment. So by the time President Obama came in, it was a smooth transition of personnel and technology.
Oh, okay.
So that's one of the things with our kids today, or our young folks, just giving them an education where they can be flexible and critically think and make things happen in the world that we're in.
And that's important. Well, what do you do now in your day-to-day employment? Are you self-employed? Excuse me. Are you self-employed, or do you hire yourself out through another company? Do you do consulting work? Or
well, primarily right now at this, I do contract work for General Dynamics. I work at a battlefield simulation center. So what we basically do is units as they're going to different places in the world. They come in, the leaders, and we program scenarios for them, and they fight the scenarios, and then they deploy.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah. So in my particular, I was a intelligence officer most of my career in the military. Okay. So that's my area of expertise. So I do a lot of advising in that area. For military.
All right. I want to go back now to your time with the PTA. I know you started off by talking about what it is that you did or how you got involved in the PTA. I would like to know how you made it from being told that you're going to be the vice president of the PTA and then end up becoming the first Black national president of the PTA.
The first male. Lois Jean White was the first back in the late 97 and 99. I was the first African-American male. Okay. But no problem. No, basically what we did, so with schools, I'm a solution-based person, and being a military-based person, what is the answer to the problem? So you talk to people, you gather information, you look at different things, and you come to a decision. But there's a model for schools that we use. you want to make sure that schools are welcoming to families. That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, you want to make sure that you're communicating effectively with stakeholders in the school.
Mm-hmm.
Third, you want to make sure that you're supporting student success.
Okay.
And you want to make sure that you're supporting every student,
Right.
not just groups.
Right.
You want to make sure that you're doing power sharing. And then you want to make sure that you're engaging the community.
Mm-hmm.
So with that underpinning model, that was the approach we took
Mm-hmm.
to the school that I was a vice president. So the first year, because we used those techniques, we were able to move from 20 members to 200 members.
Oh, wow.
And we had a good relationship with the principal. One of the positions in PTA is that you support the principal and the school leadership.
Right, right.
So that's one of the things we really emphasize. We're here to support you. What can we do? So we did a lot of things to welcome families. We got people out to, greet
Mm-hmm.
at a high school, people in the morning,
Mm-hmm.
Greeting people at the counters and events. So we did that and just started getting information out on a regular basis, once a month. Every time we had a PTA
Mm-hmm.
meeting, we would say, here's what we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the next meeting. We would
Mm-hmm.
love to see you
Mm-hmm.
there. So that was the first year. Second year, I became president, and we moved from 200 to 400.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, we began working with the school district, the superintendent, and they were impressed with the parent engagement and community engagement that we had.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I had the post commander that, worked with me and said, anything you need. So over time, over the course of 3 to 5 years, we were able to get 200 companies, and they call it the Meet Alliance now, to adopt the school and the school district. So our kids were getting internships,
That's
apprenticeships. We were getting like $1 to $2 million worth of scholarships for our senior class a year from these companies. And this was like a model school. It's one of the top, after about 5 years of doing that work, it was like one of the top school districts in the country.
Oh, wow.
And that was the goal. I mean, when we went in, because the commander said, Otha, the principal said, we want the best schools in Maryland. And the commander and I, being military, we said, no, we want world-class schools.
Right.
And we actually built a system now. You can look at Anne Arundel County schools, and it's one of the best school systems in the country. And I think with Georgia, that's one of the things that I could, you can introduce things, but as state school superintendent, understanding the role, you have an administrative role. But I think what I would bring to the table too is an advocacy type.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Good to know.
Yeah.
Okay. When it was announced that you were the newly elected first African-American male national president of the PTA, where were you? How did you feel?
Well, being the first, I've been the first on a couple other things, but being the first, you have a heavy responsibility, because just like President Obama, I watched him come into office, and just like you carry the weight of the world and say, I got to do this right, because if not, then you think about the impact that it will have in the future.
I don't think the office is like that today, but okay.
Yeah.
That's how it should be.
So I want to say something, though. I think something important, though, is I actually was sworn in Cincinnati, Ohio. I did my, not my ceremony, but my reception at the Underground Museum there. And I talked about...
You mean Underground Railroad?
Yeah, museum.
Oh, wow.
It's in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I used to cross the river there to get into. And I talked to them about how our ancestors, the sacrifices they get to do, their freedom, and education is one of those things to help us get there.
It is.
Yeah. Oh,
education is. I'm going to get to education. Hold on one second. Okay. What was probably the most important accomplishment that you had as national president of the PTA?
We got a lot accomplished, but I'll say a couple of things.
Okay.
ESSA, Every Student's a Seeds Act.
Okay.
I actually had the opportunity to sit down with the Education Committee, Senator Lamar Alexander on that committee, Bobby Scott on the House side, and talk through, hey, we want to make sure that parents and other stakeholders have input and say in the system. We're owners in the system.
Right.
So we were able to get that language put in, and I work with my staff to make sure they got the language as they crafted the bill. So that went through. So I said that's number one, and we can. I saw the other month when they were providing input back to the federal government, and I said, we played a role in making that happen. The national PTA in getting language put in the bill for stakeholders.
Okay.
So that was number one. So that was number one. Number two, when I was president-elect, as I travel around the country into our units outside of the country in our territories, people say, well, what are you going to do for our kids? And I said, I'm for all kids. I want to make sure.
President Obama got that question a lot.
So I started a program called Every Child in Focus, which still is there. They adopted it.
Okay.
But basically what I did, I said, okay, here's what I want to do. Every month I want to focus on a group of children from particular groups. And what we will do, we will talk about the great things they're doing, and then we'll talk about the challenges. And then I would like for the unit or state to focus on how they want to address this over the next year. So I'll give you an example. January was month of the suburban child. So all the units looked at that. February, month of the African American child. March was the foster child. April was the military child.
Wow.
May was Asian Pacific Islander.
Okay.
June was a rural child.
Okay.
August was the international child because of children we have of immigrants that are in this country and some of the challenges. September, the Hispanic child. October, the urban child. November, the Native American child, and December, special needs.
Wow.
So we would do
impressive.
Yeah. So we would do town halls. Like I give an example for special needs. I remember I went to Detroit, December, I think 2013, did a town hall. And the reason, as national president, we would pick things, you would say, which state has the most and the most experience. So I went to Detroit, which had 25% of their student body were special needs. For the rural child, I went to New Mexico, where the majority of rural kids are in that state. So that's what we sort of did, and it really made a difference in people saying, yes, you're paying attention to our children, and plus every child fit in one or two of those categories. Okay.
Seems like you did a lot as national president of the PTA. Now I understand that you have aspirations to seek office, the same office that I sought back in 2014. Which is that of state school superintendent. Was it your role as national president of the PTA that pretty much led you to want to seek this position, or is it something that you have had in your heart to do all along?
No, what led me to it was, again, I've had a life of service. I was active in scouting, and it was all about serving. So that's what I did. Okay. And then once as I mentioned, going to Morehouse, I looked at the servant leaders like Martin Luther King, Maynard Jackson, and said, that's what I want to do. I want to be able to give back to, society. So as I retired out of the military, I retired pretty young, 43, 44 years old, and it was like, I got a whole nother 50 or 60 years.
Hey, I hear you.
So I asked the question, how could I serve? How can I serve? So based upon, working in education for over a decade, because I served over a decade on the National PTA Board in some capacity up to chair. And I said, what way could I best serve Georgia? And so when I started, looking at the positions and thinking about it, I said, okay, this is where your experience and background, and you've helped shape national education policy. And even with Georgia, I was legislative chair in Georgia for Georgia PTA from 2010 through 11. So I got the opportunity to work down at the Capitol and see how they did, policy in Georgia. Every state, there's nuances and differences. So I saw that, and as I thought about it, I said, you know what? I think I can make the most positive impact for our children in that position. So that's how I came to that decision. Because I talked to people about, different people, and I said, this is what I'm thinking about. And it's like, yep, I think you do a great job for the state of Georgia.
Okay. Now let's go back to where you lived throughout the state of Georgia.
Sure.
You're from Elberton,
Mm-hmm.
but you were only there briefly.
Yep.
You grew up mostly in Savannah.
Augusta.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then you live close to Savannah now.
Yes, I live right below Savannah.
You also, of course, lived in Atlanta, where you were in school here.
Mm-hmm.
And you lived in Columbus.
Mm-hmm. And Smyrna for 2 years.
Okay.
So I got out of the military.
So do you think that living in all those different places throughout the state can help you get a better understanding of the different people in those areas and how to use that knowledge to help you understand what those superintendents would need in those different areas throughout the state?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. And I'll tell you why. I've worked with superintendents since I've been here in rural, urban, and suburban communities. I was an assessor on Cobb County Board of Parent Assessor back in 2011-12 time frame. So I got to work with the board and help evaluate their strategic plan and objectives. In Elberton, I know our superintendent very well there, Mr. Chuck Bell, and I've consulted with him and provided advice and resources and other superintendents around the state. So as you go to different areas, like rural areas, when they have challenges with their population shrinking and jobs and economic development, you go to cities and you have particular problems and challenges there. So I'm able to look at that and look at their challenges, because it's not a one size fit all. And you have to really take those things into consideration and how can we best support these particular school districts based upon their needs.
Okay. Now, when you were national president of the PTA, I know that you were against the governor's plan to take over failing schools. Unfortunately, he got his wish. It is in place today.
Sure.
Explain that program, the acronym OSD.
I'll be happy
and
to.
Also explain how, if you are elected state school superintendent, how will you work with the local superintendents to make sure that they're not overtaken by the state and can still operate independently?
Great question. Well, the Opportunity School District. The Opportunity School District was legislation. They wanted to do it, make it a constitutional amendment. And what a lot of people don't realize, once you get a constitutional amendment, it's almost impossible to reverse. So basically, what they wanted to do was the governor would have appointed a superintendent, and they would have, that superintendent would have determined what failing schools or priority schools they want to take over. And the legislation, that was 13 pages, you would basically, once a school came into the system, they would have to, pass or succeed, the standards for 3 years straight. So if they passed it for 2 and failed on the 3rd, then they would stay in the program 3 more years. So it was like they were being there for perpetuity.
Right.
And a lot of people, and this is where I have a great advantage from working with the U.S. Congress and the Georgia Assembly. Reading legislation and understanding the impact that laws have on people. So with the OSD bill, it had language in there that basically says everything in this bill overrides all law. And a lot of people didn't catch that. So I'm saying basically they can do anything they want to. They can bring in private. They can bring in private companies. They can discriminate because the law says they can do whatever to their discretion.
The governor could appoint whoever he wanted.
That is correct.
For that position.
That is correct. So here's my take on that. And then, like you say again, House Bill 338, they couldn't do it constitutionally, so they did it legislatively. So how would I deal with that? Well, first of all, let me back up a little bit. I've seen this somewhere else. as national president.
Oh, wow.
In Michigan.
Okay, right.
I actually,
a great example.
Yeah, December 2014.
Okay.
The Michigan PTA called me up to Detroit to sit down with their school board. And, at the time they were going through the bankruptcy matter. The schools were, a lot of private charter school systems there. And as I was sitting there talking about solutions to them, as I would mention to them, and all of them would look at the emergency manager. And the emergency manager would say, well, yeah, we can do that or not. And I'm like, wait a minute. We have duly elected school board members here, but they don't have the power that they were invested by the people. So that would have been the same thing with this OSD. Now, instead of calling the emergency manager or superintendent, they call it the chief turnaround officer.
Right.
So exactly. I look at it from a constitutional standpoint. They talk about the Constitution a lot. But again, you have these constitutional positions. And although the governor is at the top of that, what you're doing is you're crossing into responsibilities. Now, I believe whoever the governor is, the state school superintendent should work with the governor.
Exactly.
But the people elected the school superintendent to meet the needs and requirements of the school district and the education support and activities in the state.
Right.
So that's something that we would need to talk about, as far as getting in office and try to move. Why do we need a chief turnaround officer when you have laws and things in place that you can take care of that within the superintendent's office? So you're going to pay someone a couple $100,000. They talk about less government, but you're building the bureaucracy there, and you have great people at the Department of Education that can fix the schools. And if you want to be, and we want to be honest about it, when you look at problems or you look at challenges we have in schools, it comes down to two things: poverty and race. 60% of our kids in Georgia are on reduced and free meals. So you gotta handle the poverty problems and the racial issues that we have. Now, I will tell you this right here. If 60% of our kids are in poverty, one of the things that I worked with some groups with last year is Senate Bill 30, and that was community schools. Within that bill, it dealt with wraparound services. If a kid's hungry, if a kid is physically ill or can't do it, you can't teach them. And like I said, in my teaching experience, I had to, as a professor, I had to hire my students on where their mental state, are they eating well? If you really care as a teacher, you look at those things and say, are their general needs being met? Are they taking care of themselves so that you can teach them and get the outcomes that you need to get?
I completely agree with you. Okay, going back now, I guess tying in federal legislation with state legislation or state policy, I should say, in order to get federal funding, race to the top, which I strongly dislike. I do understand accountability. What is your definition of teacher accountability?
Well, I always tell teachers and parents, education begins at home.
Thank you. It does.
But unfortunately, everyone's home's not equal.
Right.
And then because of challenges, we have parents having to work 2 and 3 jobs and just trying to survive. Whether you may have another family, like say I was fortunate, although I didn't grow up with a silver spoon. With my kids, I was, my wife and I were able to create an environment where all they had to worry about is going to school and doing their work. A lot of kids don't have that opportunity in Georgia. So race to the top, I'm very familiar with it. I think I mentioned to you, I did receive an endorsement from Secretary Duncan for my work. And, we had those conversations about some things that we didn't necessarily agree with.
Right.
But I looked at the big picture and said, okay, we're going to get $400 million okay, we have teachers that are going to lose jobs because we're not funding education in Georgia. Because I was talking to Secretary Ducky when this was going on.
Okay.
And so, and Georgia was pushing back. We had people pushing back on it. And I'm saying, wait a minute, guys, we can work through some things here with $400 million.
Right. Okay.
And as you saw in the Every Student Succeeds Act, some of those things that teachers and administrators said, look, we don't want to do that. AYP went away. And if you, and a lot of people, they don't study history. If you go back to 2000, when President Bush was doing No Child Left Behind, I said up front when I saw that, it is not realistic for 100% of kids to be reading on grade level in 2014.
That's so true. But how he got us was he also promised that every school would be equal 100%, and that didn't happen.
That is correct.
As a matter of fact, schools were penalized. And going back to testing, do you feel that testing is an adequate way to measure teacher success as well as student success?
No. I am if you were to take my SAT scores, I did average. Okay. But that did not take away from hard work,
right?
Commitment, put in extra work to go all the way from a poorhouse to the White House. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So it goes back to work. It goes back to nurture. I had great teachers and a great mom that encouraged us. And so all your environment and like I say, the school is like really the center of most communities because, 90% of our kids go to public schools. So that's why we really need to properly invest and do the right things about that. Now, testing is a requirement. I think over testing, like Georgia, and again, I will have to, double check this. I think we test like almost 2 or 3 times as much as other states. You shouldn't have to do that. You have to do assessments,
right?
To make sure people are tracking and you get the outcomes. I got it.
Right.
But over testing and testing does not completely evaluate. And we can talk about HBCUs, how they say that a better indicator of minority students is a grade point average, not a SAT or ACT. And I love our friend, Dr. Calvin Mackey, who is, man, this guy is like phenomenal, doing STEM around the country, works for the government doing nuclear inspections. But it's funny, he tells this story, and I'll make this very short. He talks about when he left New Orleans, he said he went up to the Georgia Tech table and with 800 SAT score.
Oh my!
And then the guy says, he said, "Well, what do you want to be?" He said, "I want to be an engineer." and he looks at his score and he said, "It's not going to do it." He said, "Well, I'll tell you what. I know a school that might could help you." So he pointed him up to Morehouse. So the guy he moved and he said, "I want to be an engineer." He said, "What's your SAT?" He said, and he said that the guy looked at him and says, "You're a diamond in the rough, but a diamond sure enough."
Wow.
So with us,
right,
with different groups, you have to take those things into consideration.
True.
And I'll just give you another example of testing. I went to the officer candidate school. Again, I didn't come from a well-to-do family, but I remember one of the questions that stood out to me was, how do you measure a horse? How many inner city kids would know how do you measure a horse? By hands. But I knew that. So that's the cultural.
From Atlanta.
Yeah, that's some of the cultural.
My mother probably would have. She grew up in Fayetteville, which, by the way, is not the country anymore, but it used to be. Okay.
But that's some of the cultural biases and tests, and if you're just not familiar with it.
Right.
And the only reason I knew that is because I loved to read as a child. So, I think it was a hand, and got that question right.
Well, you bring up an interesting point about loving to read as a child. One of the things that I wanted to do when I was a candidate for state school superintendent is to align with what President Obama was trying to do as it relates to mandatory pre-K throughout the state for all students, possibly starting at the age of 3. I know there are some gubernatorial candidates who want to start even earlier than that, such as 2. Yes, we do have a lottery, but in my opinion, I believe all students need to have access to pre-K the same. Do you agree with that? Do you have any plans in place to address that if you're elected state school superintendent?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, again, let's go back. We'll go national and come to state level. I was pushing with President Obama and Secretary Duncan on investing in early childhood.
Okay.
So I'm still there. And again, there are 119. Our budget for 2018 is $119 million short. So we can find the money. If we can find money to get Amazon, try to get lure Amazon to Georgia, or help with the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, we can find money to fund pre-K.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be lottery. It really comes down to political will and advocacy, and also finding companies with the resources that are willing to invest. So that's sort of where we look at that. Because here's something I make an interesting point to folks. You know, Georgia has been ranked #1 in business for the last 3 or 4 years. #1 place to do business. But we're ranked 44th in child well-being. So that tells me that we're really taking care of businesses by offering them all, tax breaks, tax incentives to come here. But we're not investing in our kids. And then when we continue to drop down from 34, I think we're 38 now, ranked nationally, education systems. We should be moving up, and we can do that. And again, about finding resources and political will and calling people out when you have to.
I agree. Okay, let's see. Why should I support you? By the way, I just want to give a disclaimer. Rita Robinzine, the Rita Robinzine Show, Fanciful Films Entertainment Company, is not endorsing a candidate. Of course, I'm going to vote when the time comes. Why should I get behind you?
Well, first of all, I say you look at people's track record. I'm 50 years old. I have a life of public service. And I have the experience and the wherewithal to make things happen. This position it requires executive skill sets. I have over a decade of executive skill sets working with national, and not only the state of Georgia, but other states. So what I bring to the table is the will to listen, to support school districts and introduce them to resources that are available. My family has been in Georgia for over 7 generations. So I've grown up in Georgia. So I'm homegrown. However, I've been exposed to the world. So I can bring in ideas and resources that really makes a difference. And that's why, and again, I think my heart are for children. I mean, a lot of politicians say that, but you can look at my work. Even as a military officer, I would go back to Elberton, and I would go to schools in Savannah and Augusta and talk to kids and say, hey, education is important. Here are the things that you can do with a great education. And that's what you will get. And being a retired colonel from the military, one of the unfortunate things about politics is the money piece. A lot of people, they go to the highest bidder. And I tell people, I'm not for sale. I'm here for
That's what I said.
Yep, I'm here.
Which is why I ran, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask you kind of a hard question, in my opinion.
Okay.
When I was a candidate for state school superintendent, all of us had experience in education except for 2, and they were actually the 2 who made it to the runoff. And I guess my question to you would be, how is it that since you have not gone through the public school setting in terms as a public school teacher and administrator, how will you be able to relate to those who have, or what will set you apart from an opponent who may be able to say that, hey, I know what it's like to be a teacher. I have been in the classroom. I have been a principal. I know the stress that teachers deal with when it comes to testing or whatever. How will you answer that question?
Oh, that's a great question. And I will say a couple of things. Number one, a superintendent is different from a teacher. A superintendent requires that you have an executive skill set that can take a vision that you've collectively and collaborated with people and advocate for the things for those teachers. Okay. Now, understanding a school system, again, I had children in school. My wife's an educator. Again, I shared with you that I helped create and build one of the top school districts in the country. So as a stakeholder, I had to work with principals. I was appointed by superintendent for in Anne Arundel County for creating high-performing schools, high schools. I was appointed by Governor of Maryland for Education Committee. So I had to work with teachers. I actually was a judge for National Teacher of the Year for 2 years. So, interacting, working with teachers. Okay. So I get it. And so I'll give you another perfect example. I'm traveling around the state now. I've probably been to around 20, 25 counties. So when I talk to teachers, I listen. Good. And to educators. That's so important. And they say, so what are the challenges that you're having? So with executive skill set, with being able to listen, I can say, teachers say, well, we have a problem with overcrowding classrooms. Yes, we got 30 to 40 kids. So I hear that. 34, 30. That's right.
Thank you, Georgia legislature.
Yeah. So I could sit there and go, okay, so we're short $119 million, dollars in our budget that they could, that we need funding. And we have 30. So how do I need to advocate as an executive, state education executive, on getting that $119 million to get more teachers in the classroom? How do I, as a state executive, advocate with the state legislature to deal with the teacher retirement challenge that we're having? So that's executive. So right. In a classroom, like I mentioned earlier, being in a class, I have education experience.
You have taught before.
Comparable. Yeah. Again, I had to teach learning objectives. What are the learning objectives and what are the outcomes? How do I assess my students to make sure that they're meeting the requirements to say they're a bona fide graduate to finish this school? Okay. Here's a challenge. Though. I love this analogy. Someone says, the legislators sometimes think about Coca-Cola. Okay. Coca-Cola has a formula.
It does.
The teachers and educators in Georgia, they have a formula. They know what works. So do they legislate to Coca-Cola how they're going to build their formula to make their product that's successful, or do they go to the teachers?
Right. So they never come to the teachers, absolutely. And that's the problem. Yeah. I think there's a quote that says, "Those who know nothing about education are the ones who make the decisions about education." I was at a meeting not too long ago where two top superintendents were present. My superintendent, Dr. Green from DeKalb County, Dr. Karstafen out of Atlanta Public Schools. And it was, it was a relaxed setting. Hopefully I'm not going to get in trouble. But anyway, it was interesting because you got to hear their side of the issues and what they deal with. And it's almost like, how teachers sound when they're talking about certain things and certain problems and concerns that we sometimes have. And they were talking about how Georgia has all these lists and all of these requirements that they need to follow, and probably more than any other state. Are you familiar with these lists? And are you going to do anything to reduce them so that our superintendents will not be so stressed out trying to either stay off a list or get on a list?
Well, Well, again, remember we talked about the over testing.
Right.
Again, any way we could, how can we reduce the testing? Okay. There are solutions to it, and we know it. The second thing is, like I say, with legislators, have you spoken with the teachers?
No.
Have you spoken? And again, those things that I'm doing now, and I will continue to do.
Good.
Because if I'm going to be an advocate, then I need to say, hey, here's what my teachers are saying. And I've worked with some of your teacher associations in Georgia, a couple of them, not all of them, and say, what's your take on this? What is going on with this? And just getting great input and feedback from them. And that's something that I will not cease to do. But let me give you, I think that to give you a better idea of Georgia, here's the elephant in the room with Georgia.
Okay.
Brown versus Board of Education, 1954.
Right.
Okay. The Georgia Department of Education started in 1870. They started off with separate and equal schools, which we know was not.
Separate, but.
So a lot of people don't study the history, but Georgia in 1954 said, we refuse to honor Brown versus Board. And if you move to 1956, Governor Griffin at the time, and this is in the history, you can check it out, he said, we will privatize every school in Georgia before we integrate. I'm from Elberton. My schools began integration in 1967 and then fully integrated until 1972. Okay. And so this was in some parts of Georgia. So at every turn, we've had the Georgia Assembly, for the most part, trying to go around Brown versus Board. So I'll give you a perfect example today. A lot of people don't know this. We have something called a student scholarship organization. All that is a backdoor voucher to send people to private schools. Last year, Georgia spent $60 million on. So basically, if you want to send your kid to a private school, I think this upcoming year, I could invest $9,450 into your student scholarship organization
And write it off, right?
as a tax credit. So that's just, you're subsidizing private schools.
Exactly.
And that goes back to one of my core values. You can look at public schools as a public good or private good. I look at public schools as a public good. And we have a lot of people that look at education, not, I shouldn't say a lot, they look at it as a private good, and they want to meet their needs and make money off of public schools, and that should not be the case, and that is problematic.
And that is the problem. And I guess that was going to be my next question, is what is the biggest problem you do see with public education, and I guess the privatization. I have worked 29 years. This is the beginning of year 29 for me. I'm rare. I'm very rare. As a matter of fact, people are like, 29 years, that's unheard of.
Sure.
And I know you said a lot about attracting teachers, but what do you have put in place for teacher retention?
Well, I know Georgia has lost, I think, around a third of their teachers for the first 5 years or the last couple of years. Well, first of all, it starts off with respect. You know, you don't put down teachers. And I will tell you, I think Georgia has some great schools. It's just the narrative, and sometimes our legislators, you know, saying all these things just to get their legislation through.
Right.
So first of all, respecting teachers. It's a respected profession. Everybody is touched by a teacher, every profession.
That's right.
So that's first. The second thing in retention is, let's go back to retirement plan, which the Assembly is going to have to give a couple $100 million to show off the accounts. Why are we doing that? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So teachers have to be comfortable that when you retire in a couple of years, that your retirement is going to be in the bank. And you're not worried about taking cuts or your health benefits. So that's how you retain teachers. It's in educators, it is a contract that the state made with you, and then once you make that commitment, we need to do it. So I think, you know, through respect, through retirement, ensuring that you protect them, and offering other incentives for teachers.
Okay. not sure how much time I have, but I do want to ask you this. There are some school districts that like to hire Teach for America teachers. Okay.
Yep.
And a lot of times, though, those same districts are critical of teachers who have gone through the education program and have degrees in education. Should the state hire more people who just come out of college without any type of educational training? Or should the state spend time in, well, of course, I'm talking about the public university system, put more emphasis on educational programs to better train and equip teachers for the classroom?
I'm more inclined to the traditional teacher track. And what I mean by that is the average teacher, they set in their mind that I want to be a teacher.
Right.
So they go through 4 years of training and then continue training. So, and a lot of times they come from the community. So they understand the community that they're in. With Teach for America, again, teacher shortages, trying to fill a role and establish themselves, they come about. But again, I'm personally more inclined because they're here. They're not going away. But the traditional teachers that have invested years of training and have taken the time to, you know what I'm saying, that they love their profession, we want to make sure, because sometimes, and I won't take anything away from Teach for America teachers, some of them, they just want to try or do something different.
Right.
And career change, you know. So that's something we look at, but I'm more on the role of traditional teachers with the training.
Okay. Let's see. One more question. You talked about working with former Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan. Betsy DeVos is, well, she's interesting.
Oh, yeah.
How would you work with her? Or because I would assume that at some point every state superintendent will have to work with her in some fashion.
Okay. Well, I'm a principled and progressive person.
Okay.
So here's the deal.
Okay.
And I have no problems looking at her in the eye and saying, you know, I support public schools 100%. I'm not for vouchers.
Good.
I'm not for contracting everything out.
Right.
And that has not been her experience.
Right.
She went to private schools, her kids to private schools, everything.
Everything.
So that's what they understand.
Right.
So my role would be to protect our public schools and enhance them. Now, let me share some insight with you.
Okay.
When I was working with the U.S. Congress, the Republicans at the time, they had not anticipated on a Republican president being elected. So when they did Every Student Succeeds Act, they built it to take away as much power from the federal education department as possible. So they put, block grants, put a lot of things, a lot of power back to the states. And this is what happens. So that gives the state school superintendents a lot more power than they had in the past. So it's going to be interesting.
It is.
There was a big battle in AJC a couple of weeks ago with the superintendent and the governor where he didn't agree with what he sent up. But the Secretary of Education will make the final decision on whether they accept it or reject it. And she will probably go with her state school superintendent.
Cool. That's good to know. When I was a candidate for state school superintendent, I wrote an article that came out January 1st in the AJC 2014, and I pretty much talked about some of the things that I wanted to do had I got elected. One of the problems that I see in education is that we try to get all of the students to matriculate through the educational system as if they're going to college. And because of that, a lot of students are not successful. Testing is a problem. That's a frustration for them. And I'm not going to talk what I said I wanted to do to address those students the needs of those students who may not want to go to college.
Sure.
Do you have anything in place or any plan that you would like to see implemented if you become state school superintendent?
Yes, and I can tell you about 4 or 5 years ago, I started with the career pathways.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that only 25% of Georgians have a bachelor's degree. So what's happening with the other 75%?
Right.
So my thing is, we should educate a child who, if they want to go to college, technical school, career, or military, we just make sure they can read, write, and critically think so they can make that decision. So I'm a big advocate. And again, the school system I was in Maryland, Anne Arundel school system, what we did, the kids basically between 8th and 9th grade took a career inventory and they went to the career path and they got opportunities as they went through. And if they changed their mind, then they switched to another career path. But we have to make education where kids are interested and that we're really meeting their interests.
Right.
And that's the way we do it. So I'm all for technical education. As a matter of fact, I know Dr. Andrea Daniels now.
Okay.
We were classmates from Elton. She's president of Athens Tech.
Oh, wow.
I spoke at their graduation about 2 years ago and just, great talking to her about some of the things we can do as we move forward.
Okay, good. I don't know if I've gone over my hour or not, but I'm going to ask you a few more questions, or one more, I should say. Looks like you like making history. You may end up being the first African-American state school superintendent. I don't think you've had one before. Win or lose, what's next for Otha Thornton?
Well, I will continue.
Okay.
After I left the National PTA president, I continued to advocate for children, and that's what I will do. I will continue to advocate. I've done it all my life.
Okay.
And so I will continue to be an active advocate in the community to make sure our kids get a great education.
Well, I wish you much success with your endeavors. And again, I'm happy to have my Morehouse brother here, Dr. Otha Thornton, to speak about his life, his career, and his ambition to become the next state school superintendent of Georgia. Please go to Fanciful Films Co. on YouTube, subscribe to my channel. Also go to my Instagram at Rita Robinzine, as well as my Twitter account. This has been a Fanciful Films Entertainment Company production. Have a nice evening, Atlanta. Did I go over my word?
4 minutes.